HDR and Flambient, as you probably know, are the two top techniques for doing real estate photography. But these aren't competing techniques. It's not a matter of knowing if you should use HDR or if you should use Flambient. It's a matter of when, where, why, and how to use HDR or Flambient, or a combination of the two. So what I want to do in this episode is compare the two. We're going to compare quality, which of course is something that's very important, but there's more to it than that. A lot is going to be based also on the type of clients that you're after, the market that you're in, the various geographic regions, and the price and competition that's going to relate to that also. So let's dive into this, but first let's take a look at the quality of HDR, what that really means from a high overview as it compares to Flambient. Then let's talk about why both are necessary and how to go about incorporating both of these into your work as a real estate photographer. So first let's take a look at the standard HDR work. Now this is actually a high-end HDR image that I've done, and we're going to compare it against a Flambient image and what was all involved between the two. I'm going to take a look at some other ones that I've brought up here too, but this is a very simple example where you would go in and you would shoot a bracket. You can see this is very bright, and then there's another one up here that would be dark, and just by using some simple luminosity masking, which I show in my expert editing course, you can blend these together and you've got a really well-balanced image. Now, you can also cut in the windows up here, and there's ways to do that, but one of the things that I like to do is I like to incorporate flash here, and that was a darken mode window pull. This is like the easiest flash thing to incorporate, and once again, these are things that I teach in my courses. So doing that then, I've got a view to the outside, and this layer up here was just a color correction layer. It just neutralized a lot of the colors. Now, there's still more that can be done to this because this is just the blending portion. We haven't then done any of the post-processing that you would to do any of the other, like bumping up some of the contrast or whatnot. This is just blending. But doing the same thing with Flambient, we can see a difference. So here we are with the Flambient example, and you can see once again comparing HDR to Flambient, we immediately see a difference, and this is why. What I first do is I've got down here a flashed shot. Now you can see that while I'm doing just this flash shot, I can already see the views outside to the window. I'm cutting out nearly all the ambient light, and of course this isn't everything that I need. I need to incorporate some ambient luminance, and that's where this comes in. So this was just an ambient layer, just an ambient shot like I would for HDR, but it's in luminosity mode at 50%. Then I'd add another one up here that I can add a little bit more ambient luminance where I want to. So I'm in control of where the light of the ambient is, but I don't have to worry about its color. Then of course, the same technique I used on the HDR, I just add in a darken mode window pull. But unlike the HDR example that I just showed you, there was no color correction that was needed. This actually then makes editing very quick. But it gets a little bit more complex than that, because what's not shared very often when doing HDR is when you come across something like this. Now, this is one of the nightmare situations where it's a small place, it's an old place. You think, well, I don't want to put much effort into it, but these need a lot more care than when you were doing, for instance, HDR on something here that has a lot of neutral colors. So here, being a problematic one, we can do the same HDR technique, and at the end of the day, this is what I came up with for doing this as an HDR example. But doing Flambient for this one, you can see there's a world of difference, and there's also fewer layers that were involved, so the editing was faster. When I was doing HDR here, I had this ambient shot, and then I did luminosity masking, which you can see here. Then I had to start adding some various color corrections, and that's what all these layers were for here. So now I've got something that's got some decent colors, but it still just looks flat. Now I can add in the same darken mode window pull just like I did before. This was just a flash shot, just you can see the flashes up here, and it's flashing that window so that I don't have to cut into windows. I could just do a darken mode window pull. But even at the windows, look at the difference here where the beams are compared to doing a Flambient shot. Just a world of difference. Also take a look at some of the color, the brightness, and also the shadows. It's very different. This is the HDR version, and this is the Flambient version. So with the Flambient version, I'm in a lot more control. For instance, all I had to do was start out with a two-sided composite. A flash is near the camera, and then I flash both sides and just edit myself out. I then add my ambient layer that's in a luminosity blending mode. In this case, I only had the opacity at 40%, and then I do my darken mode window pull. Now, this did need some other color correction, so I did that to the ceiling here, and then I applied some final adjustments here, and then also one last color adjustment here to really help this out. But you can see that the quality of this is very different. Look at the color, for instance, of the woods over here compared to on HDR. I can't even really here bring up, even though I add this final bump here, I can't really bring up the colors of the wood because I have to desaturate so much out of this. In fact, if we bring this up into Camera Raw to see what was done, similar to what you would do in Lightroom Classic, you can see that the saturation had to be brought down just to get rid of enough of the color casts. But at the same time, even though we got better results with Flambient, and even though this one was quick, let's take a look at something more difficult. So this is a view of a larger space. And by the way, if you're wondering, yes, this is the inside of my house. I use this as a test subject for stuff like this quite often. But in here, this is the HDR version that I came up with, and this is the Flambient version. And you might notice there really probably isn't too much difference, but I'm going to point out the differences here and things that would be noticed by some of the higher end clients. First, let's take a look at the HDR and what was involved. You'll notice there are fewer layers than if I did the Flambient, and I'll get to why in just a second. Here though, when we go to the HDR version, same thing. I started out with this bright one, I did some luminosity masking on just another ambient shot, got something really good, and did the simple color corrections with the neutralized layer like I show in my courses. Then I did a whole bunch of other color layer corrections here. That's what these were for different types of hue and saturation that really needed to be taken care of. Then, like I've done in the other ones, I decided to do darken mode window pulls using Flash. It's so easy to do, you just might as well do it. Just bring a flash in and do it. It doesn't take any more time, just a couple seconds. Now, there was over here a very bright spot. This was from a cathedral window that was above the camera. Couldn't get rid of it no matter what, so I just used some AI and got rid of it. Easy enough. And then some final color corrections. So this looks good, and for a lot of real estate listings, this would be fine using this method. Now, using the Flambient method, we've got something that is of a higher quality, but it has more layers, and here's why. So I'm flashing, but you can see one flash isn't enough. So then you start adding in other flash layers like this one that would be used in light and blending mode to then bring in the other areas that need to be pumped up. That's what this is for. And then I can start adding in the ambient luminance as I see fit, and then add in the window pulls just like I've done before. Now, one of the things you'll notice is there's really no color corrections needed, although I did do some for up here, and that's what this layer is here, and then a final one here, and then also to get rid of that big spot, just like we did with the HDR one, I just did a little gen fill. But now let's compare this to the HDR version here. One of the things that'll stand out right away is how blue this is right here. That's because the blue sky in these picture windows way up here is beaming in all kinds of blue light. That doesn't exist when I'm using Flash using the Flambient technique. This is something that would stand out to luxury clients and also to when you're working with interior designers, like for architectural design work. Now, could this be color corrected? Sure, you could add even more color correction layers on top of this. But when we go over here, we can also notice that the shadows are more controlled. Over here, I'm getting a weird harsh shadows up here and just in different places because I'm not really in control because I'm not controlling the light. When I'm doing Flambient, I'm in control of the light. I decide where the light's going to be, not just from the flash itself, but also the amount of ambient luminance that I want to put into the image. So we can see the quality differences already start to reveal themselves. Now, there are times when I use HDR, I do prefer to use Flambient, but for instance, when I'm doing commercial spaces, it's difficult to be able to carry a lot of lights around, so I do minimal lighting. So I'll be doing HDR for a lot of commercial spaces, and then I'll incorporate some flash just for getting the window pulls. Sometimes I'll also do that, but what I'm doing is I'm carrying like an 8200 Pro in my back pocket. Most of it's done using a high-end HDR technique, doing these commercial properties, and then to get good views out the windows, then I'll incorporate flash to do the darken mode window pulls. When it comes to the listing market though, this is where it gets tricky because I do prefer Flambient almost always for the listing market. And of course, it's paid for out here in Southern California. It might not be if you're in a small town. But with using Flambient, once you get good at it, it doesn't take very long then to do it. The benefit that you get out of that is very high as far as quality, and that leads into other areas that you could then progress into. And this is why it's so important to know both. Knowing just HDR, you're going to limit yourself. And all you ever did was Flambient, well, you could probably do a lot more high-paying work, but there will come a time when you do need to incorporate some type of HDR. Like this condo amenity, these are just too large of a space to really bring a lot of lights in and do a lot of work, especially for the time constraints and during a very short window when these areas might be people-free. And that's why I teach both, for instance, in my course on expert editing for interior photography. As you may know, that's part of my series on doing real estate photography, and I've got also a course on incorporating the Flambient method, which is in my Pro Interiors course. Now, Flambient also is covered just from the editing perspective in the expert editing course, and you can see a full curriculum and what all is covered in the links that I've got down in the description of this video to learn more about my courses. But knowing both is very important, and that's why I teach both. There's been a long-running misconception that I am only a Flambient shooter, and that's not correct. Flambient does give me a much higher quality photo, and that's why for the listing market I do it, but also that's got me into other markets. So I can progress into other markets like doing architectural design and also the luxury market. So one of the allures of HDR photography is that there is very little time on site. And that's true. You also aren't investing in lights and triggers and stuff like that. But the thing is, it will take you longer to edit because you're just working off of ambient frames. So that becomes a lot more difficult to correct a lot of color issues, to be able to get rid of bloom, to try to make things sharp, get good contrast. All that stuff comes naturally once you just turn on lights. Once you start using flash, all those problems go away. So although it takes longer on site when you're using Flambient, the editing process is similar. So in other words, what we have is a zero-sum game. So ideally, you'll have just about the same amount of time overall if you were to edit and shoot your own photos doing HDR or Flambient. But this is where one of the big differences comes in with doing HDR is that there are a lot of HDR editors out there that you can outsource to. So that's become a common thing with real estate photographers to just go out, shoot some brackets real quick, be in and out of a house in 30 minutes or less, and then just send those raw files off to an editor that puts that together. Now, since it's outsourced overseas, a lot of photographers that would bring in about $100,000, $150,000 a year will pay about $20,000 to $30,000 a year in their outsource editing fees. But for me, I'd rather keep that close to home. I can also provide a faster turnaround since I'm doing it myself. Now, whether I was going to be doing HDR and I edit it myself or Flambient and edit it myself, I have that advantage of keeping the money here. But the thing is, if I only did HDR, this is where the tricky part comes in. I'm now going to compete against every single other HDR photographer in my area, and that means the photo mills. When you're not standing out with what you're doing, then it's hard to raise your prices and compete and get higher end clients. But if you do something like Flambient, where you are going to get a higher quality image and people that appreciate it and who are willing to pay for it see that, then there's a whole world of difference. This is where you can charge more for the work that you're doing. But to get a good idea of that, talking about markets, let's take a deep dive into the various markets in real estate photography, because too often it's overgeneralized as just the listing market of people just selling their homes. But there's a broad array of markets, and you'll see how this compares, not just from using HDR or Flash, but all things considered. So there are a variety of real estate photography markets, and we're familiar with it here in the blue, the listing market. Red is the luxury real estate market, then green, architectural and design, and the magenta is commercial. And if we set up a radar graph, and I've done this by the way, and I show this in more detail in my course on business and marketing for real estate photography, in here we can see how this then overlays onto various things that we need to consider. So for the listing market, we can see here in blue and where that's weighted so differently from everything else. If we start here just clockwise, quality expectations in the listing market sure are about average really compared to other markets, and the effort because of that tends to be kind of medium to low, but there's also a lower amount of income if you're just doing the standard listing market. If you'll notice in the red, the luxury listing market, that's over here overlapping with commercial, that has a higher income, right, potential with it. And of course, then architecture and design has a much higher than income with it. The sustainability too is a lot higher in these other markets. The time allowed definitely varies. But this is where it really gets interesting. When we take a look at the number of shoots to keep your business going, and then the marketing effort that might have to go into that, the listing market usually requires a lot more effort, a lot more shoots to sustain that. And I'll show why in the next graph. And that's where we're going to dive into a little bit more between HDR and Flambient. First glance though, just here real quick, is that we can see that HDR is about average for the listing market, and Flambient about the same way, but Flambient is really used a lot when we get into these other markets. But when we take a close look at HDR and Flambient, and that's what we can see in this radar graph. And we can see HDR is blue and Flambient is in red. And these are estimates that I've made from my own experience. I've seen this not just for myself, I've seen this from the students that I teach, I've seen this from a lot of my other colleagues, is that when we're talking about Flambient, we all know the quality's high. We saw that, we can see that, definitely higher than the quality of HDR, but here's the thing, Flambient takes a high amount of effort compared to HDR, but at the same time, you can get more income. So you can charge more if you're doing really good work compared to if you're not. That then leads to higher sustainability than HDR, meaning also that you can do fewer shoots. That also means your expenses are going to be lower, and one of the reasons being is that you don't have to market yourself over and over and over again. When you're competing in the HDR marketplace, you're competing against so many other photographers that just do average or below average work. I'm not saying that you can't do really good HDR, but that's what you're going to be competing against. And then you'll, as a result of that, need to do a lot more outsourcing. So taking a look now at the bigger picture, when we really compare HDR to Flambient, we know that the quality is always going to be higher when you use flash. That's a no-brainer. So you can penetrate other markets. But does that make sense where you are and the work that you're doing? And also, does it meet your goals? If you want to stay in the listing market, then there's nothing wrong with doing HDR if that's what your client expectations are, and you're going to keep your prices low enough to compete with every other HDR photographer out there. Personally, for a long sustainable business, that's not something I wanted to do. Also, I like to take really good high quality photos. But I'm proof, and a lot of other photographers are, that if you incorporate Flambient into your work, then you can provide not just a higher quality image, but you can gain better revenue. For instance, without having to outsource my photos, because shooting Flambient most of the time means that I don't have much editing that I have to do afterwards compared to doing HDR. What that means is that I keep that closer to home. I can charge more because I'm doing Flambient work. It doesn't take me any longer overall, unless I was going to do HDR and outsource it, but I have no outsourcing costs. But the biggest thing is that it also allows me to expand into other markets so that I can do architectural design, for instance, and I can also do luxury real estate. So there's a lot more behind just whether you're going to use HDR or Flambient, trying to compare the quality, and just also focusing on the listing market. Think of the bigger picture, and most important of all is to learn both techniques. They're both good tools to use, and then you can decide where you should apply one technique or the other for your business as a real estate photographer.